Stephanie ran straight into the storm. Ryan saw her from the barn. Didn't think. Just ran. The north gate was swinging wild in 60-mile-an-hour wind, iron slamming against the post over and over, and if it gave, the entire herd was gone into a Tennessee storm at night. She got it there first. Both hands on the gate, pulling against the wind, rain hitting her sideways hard enough to make her stagger. Her left hand slipped. Ryan hit the gate with his full body weight. No warning, no words. Just 200 pounds of former Marine pressed flat against iron while she found the latch with both hands and drove it home. The wind gusted again. Neither of them moved, then silence. Just rain. They were 6 inches apart. Soaked through, breathing hard. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Neither of them stepped back. And right there, in the middle of a storm, on a farm she was fighting to keep, and he had no reason to stay, something shifted. Neither of them said a word about it. They didn't have to. Ryan Clark drove into Clover Falls at 6 in the morning with $40 in his wallet, a sleeping 6-year-old in the back seat, and the specific kind of exhaustion that isn't about sleep. It's about years, the accumulated weight of too many places that almost worked. Too many fresh starts that turned out to be the same start with different weather. Biscuit had his nose jammed into the 2-inch gap Ryan had left at the top of the window, ears blown flat, eyes closed. Tail knocking a slow rhythm against the seat like a metronome counting down to something. Noah slept with his mouth slightly open and both hands curled around the composition notebook he carried everywhere. The detective journal, 43 pages of maps, observations, and questions that had no good answers. Ryan had looked through it once when Noah was at school and he had a rare hour alone. The most recent entry said, "We left again. I drew the apartment so I don't forget it." The walls were yellow. Ryan had put the journal back exactly where he found it. The GPS directed him through the county, and the county was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when you're too tired to be suspicious of them. Rolling fields going gold in the early light, hardwood lines burning orange and red along the ridge, a sky too clear for this late in October. He drove with the window cracked. The air smelled like damp soil and something he couldn't name, not unpleasant. Just unfamiliar. The sign at the county line was wooden, white letters. "Welcome to Clover Falls. Population 2,900. He read it twice. He'd found the listing 3 weeks ago on a veterans forum. He checked out of habit more than expectation. Barn restoration, Harris Farm, Clover Falls, Tennessee. Pay weekly. The listing was 4 sentences and a phone number. No photographs, no persuasion, no promise that the work was interesting or the area was worth investing in. He'd called because 4 sentences felt honest. Everything longer than 4 sentences was usually trying to sell you something. The woman who answered was direct. The barn needed structural work, north roof section compromised. 3 load-bearing posts required replacement, not reinforcement. She needed someone who could assess the job and execute without supervision. 1 question, how long had he been doing carpentry? 12 years, Ryan told her. Before the Marines and after, she said she'd expect him Monday. No small talk up, no sell, just a time and an expectation. He'd appreciated that more than she could have known. He made the turn the GPS indicated, and the road went to gravel. The tires crunched and Noah shifted without waking, and Biscuit pulled his nose from the window and sat up straight, reading the changed terrain with the focused attention of an animal who understood that gravel meant arrival. Ryan rounded the last bend and stopped, not because he'd planned to, because the farm was more than the listing had given him any reason to expect. The barn was visible immediately, red paint weathered to dull brick, the north roof line buckled where it had failed, but the barn was almost secondary to what surrounded it. Fields extending in every direction farther than made sense for a private holding. A line of old-growth oak along the eastern boundary that had to be 60 years old at minimum. The main house set back from the road, 2-story white clapboard with a wraparound porch, the kind of house that had been repaired and repainted a dozen times without ever losing its original shape. 4,000 acres. He'd looked up the deed the night before leaving Knoxville. The number hadn't meant much on a screen. Standing at the end of the drive, it meant something entirely different. Ryan exhaled. Put the truck and park. That was when he saw her. Not standing at the gate, on the barn. 1 foot on a ladder rung, 1 knee braced against the siding, a measuring tape extended along the roofline with 1 hand while the other held a spiral notebook tucked under her arm. She was reading the measurement and writing without looking at the notebook. The coordination of someone who had done this in all kinds of conditions. Ryan got out of the truck. She didn't look down immediately. She finished the measurement, pressed the tape flat with 2 fingers, wrote the number, then looked down with the expression of someone doing a rapid assessment and arriving at an answer before they've said a word. Green eyes, sharp, the kind of look that made you feel briefly translated into information. You're earlier than I expected, Ryan. I don't like being late. She came down the ladder. Not rushing, not performing steadiness either, just moving the way she moved through everything on this farm, without excess motion and without hesitation about what came next. She extended her hand when she reached the ground. Stephanie Harris. Ryan shook it. Her grip was direct. No performance in either direction. Ryan Clark. The north section needs a full roof replacement. 3 interior posts are compromised. I'd want them replaced, not reinforced. The south wall has board rot, but that's cosmetic. I can manage that myself. She turned and looked at the barn the way you look at a problem you've been thinking about for a long time. 3 weeks. Ryan walked to the barn without answering. He ran his hand along the base of the nearest post, pressed his knuckles against it at mid-height, listened. He stepped inside. The smell of old hay and machine oil, light coming through the failed roof sections in diagonal columns. He walked the perimeter, checked the joist connections, assessed the rafter tails where weather had worked in through the compromised fascia. When he came back out, he said, 4 weeks, Stephanie, 3.5. 4 weeks if you want it done right. She studied for a moment, then, all right. That was when the truck's back door opened. Noah launched out with the specific force of a 6-year-old who has been still for 7 hours and is done with that. Biscuit came after him, ears in 3 directions at once, nose immediately to the ground, tail a blur. Biscuit made it 4 feet before he redirected towards Stephanie, planted himself in front of her boots and licked the toe of her left shoe with tremendous and sincere enthusiasm. Stephanie looked at the dog, then at Ryan, Noah and Biscuit. They're a unit. Noah skidded to a stop beside the dog. He was looking at Stephanie with the concentrated evaluation he reserved for people he was deciding about. Dark curly hair, Ryan's eyes, the composition notebook already in his hands with the pen uncapped. He was drawing something, a preliminary sketch of the barn. He catalogued everything. Does this farm have horses? Stephanie, it does. No, turned to Ryan with an expression that communicated, without ambiguity, what he thought the implications of this were. Ryan did not react to it. Stephanie looked at Noah with something that wasn't quite a smile but was moving in that direction. There are 12 zones on this property. Zone 7 is the henhouse. Keep the dog out of Zone 7. Noah took the notebook, drew something, turned it to show her a rough grid with a box labeled Zone 7 hens, no Biscuit in red pen underlined twice. Stephanie looked at the map, then at Ryan. He makes maps of every place we go, I see that. She turned toward the barn. I'll leave you to get started. She walked back to the house. Ryan looked at the farm around him, the fields, the oak line, the barn with its failed north roof, the work that needed doing. He pulled his assessment notebook from his jacket pocket, got started. He spent the first hour on evaluation. Methodical. His grandfather had made him write everything down. Starting at age 11, when Ryan's impatience had cost them a full afternoon of rework on a deck in Cookville. You can't fix what you haven't fully seen. The old man had said it until it stopped sounding like advice and became simply a fact about the nature of things. Ryan wrote everything down. The north post nearest the door was the worst. Moisture damage from the base up, structural integrity, maybe 40% of what it should be. The second post not much better. The third borderline, he could have argued it either way, but he marked it for replacement because if you're already in there, you do it right or you do it twice. The roof was worse than it looked from outside. The fascia had given way in 2 places, letting weather work into the rafter tails. He'd need to pull those sections entirely, sister new rafters, run new decking before any shingles went down. Time-consuming work. The kind that couldn't be rushed without the rushing showing up years later. He was in the northeast corner, mapping the junction between the wall plate and the damaged rafter, when he heard boots on gravel. Stephanie was carrying 2 mugs. She set one on a fence post within reach and kept the other. Didn't say anything. Didn't wait. turned and looked at what he was looking at, the way she'd looked at the roofline from the ladder, adding it to a running calculation she'd been keeping. Ryan picked up the mug. Black. Coffee, strong, not quite hot enough to have been brewed minutes ago. She'd had it ready, expected him to be here, and brought it when she had a moment. He took a sip. Said, "Your father built this in '89. He'd found it in the deed." Robert Harris. Construction permit 1989. Stephanie. He broke ground in late '88, finished the following spring. A pause. He drove to Cookville for the timber. Said the local stuff was fine, but the Cookville wood was better. Ryan's hand stopped on the beam. Stewie. Cookville. He didn't say it out loud, just held the coincidence quietly. The way you hold things that feel like something without being able to say what exactly. Good timber, he said instead. Even the compromised pieces, the wood itself is still sound. It's moisture damage at the base, not the material. Stephanie made a sound that was neither agreement nor skepticism. How long does a barn like this last if it's maintained? Another 40 years minimum. Probably more. She looked at the roofline, then at a fixed point between the walls, some interior calculation running. That's what I thought. She didn't elaborate. But Ryan had the specific low-frequency awareness, the kind that had saved his life twice in places he didn't think about in daylight, that the question wasn't architectural. They worked in a loose proximity through the morning. Stephanie appeared and disappeared, checking on the farm, coming back to hold a beam or pass a tool without being asked. She wasn't trained in carpentry, but she was precise and she was willing to learn, and she never asked a question she could figure out by watching. Ryan noticed the efficiency of it. How rarely he had to explain something twice. By late morning, Noah arrived from wherever he'd been doing his systematic exploration of the property, Biscuit trailing behind with a look of someone who had been several interesting places recently. Noah reported that zones 1 through 6 were mapped. Zone 7 remained closed. Zone 8, which contained what he called a very interesting rope thing, required clarification. Stephanie looked at Ryan. Old swing in an oak tree on the south lot. He's been very restrained about asking. Stephanie turned to Noah. Zone 8 is open. Noah was already gone. Biscuit looked at the space where Noah had been, and then at Stephanie, and then followed at speed. Stephanie watched them go. Something in her expression shifted, not much, just the particular adjustment of a person who is reminded of something they hadn't thought about in a while. She turned back to the barn without comment. Ryan turned back to his work. The afternoon moved. The barn began, slowly, to show what it could be again. Earl Booker arrived on Friday of the first week. The truck was old enough that Ryan would have put it in the category of vehicles he'd worked on in the service, a Ford F-250 from sometime in the early 90s, paint faded to something between green and grey, one side mirror secured with electrical tape. It rolled in without hurrying and stopped at an angle that suggested the driver had opinions about where trucks should park. The man who stepped out was built like old farm equipment. Broad in the shoulders, deliberate in every movement, the economy of a body that had learned to conserve effort over decades of actually needing it. He wore a John Deere cap so thoroughly broken in it had taken the shape of his head. A toothpick worked the corner of his mouth. He did not look at Ryan immediately. He looked at the barn. Walked around it the way Ryan had on the first morning, not performing inspection, just seeing. He stopped near the northwest corner where Ryan had set the first new post that morning. Looked at it, pressed his knuckles against the wood. Gr Ko Dung Cho, not a compliment. A verification delivered to the post as much as to anyone present. He turned towards Stephanie, who had come out of the house at the sound of the truck. Robert built this the year my daughter was born. He said it without sentiment, just accounting. He drove to Cookville for the timber. Said the local wood was fine, but the Cookville wood was better, Stephanie. I know, Earl. Earl shifted the toothpick to the other corner of his mouth. He looked at Ryan. Not hostile, not friendly, the evaluation of a man deciding what kind of man he was looking at. Patient about it, in no hurry to finish, military? Ryan, Marines veteran. But Earl nodded once, like that answered something specific. He turned back toward his truck without additional comment, which Ryan would come to understand was as much as Earl Booker ever said about anything in a first meeting. Noah appeared from the south lot. Biscuit at his heels, notebook open. He looked at Earl, at the truck. At Earl again. He doesn't use many words, Ryan. People who know a lot usually don't. Noah wrote something. Ryan didn't ask what. Earl got back in the truck and drove off the way he'd arrived, without hurrying. The electrical tape mirror caught the afternoon light as he turned onto the county road. It was, tells our later, much later, everything that happened or that had happened. Ryan could see the full shape of it, that he understood what that visit had been. Earl Booker hadn't come to check on the barn. He'd come to check on the man fixing it. That evening, working alone after Noah had gone to bed in the guest house, Stephanie had offered them at the start of the week. The heat and water work better in there, she'd said, and Ryan had said they were fine in the motel in town, and she'd said the guest house is sitting empty, which settled it. Ryan ran through the assessment again in his head. The posts, the decking, the rafter work, the timeline. He was on track, possibly ahead. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. Being ahead of schedule on a job meant finishing sooner. And finishing sooner meant he had no particular reason to keep driving down this road. He wrote in his own notebook for a while. Lists, measurements, materials needed. The kind of documentation that was useful and also a way of sitting with something without deciding what to do about it. He put the notebook down, looked at the dark farm through the guest house window. Didn't decide anything, went to sleep. The dinner invitation came from Noah, which surprised no one who knew Noah. He had approached Stephanie on Thursday afternoon, while she was checking the water levels in the South Trough, detective journal in hand, and asked her directly whether the farmhouse had a kitchen and whether she used it. Stephanie had confirmed that it did, and that she did. Noah had looked at his notebook and then back at her, and said that they had been eating reheated things from the gas station for most of the week because his father was busy and maybe she might want company sometime. Ryan found out about this conversation from Pat Moore, who found out about it from somewhere Ryan never fully identified. The invitation had already been extended by the time he knew it needed to be declined. Stephanie didn't make it formal. She knocked on the guest house door at 5:30 on Friday evening and said dinner was at 6:30 if they wanted to come. Ryan looked at Noah, who had already put the detective journal down, which was the equivalent of a 6-year-old jumping up and down. They came. The farmhouse at evening was different from the farmhouse at dawn at that day. During the day it was background, the structure behind the woman, who was always already outside when Ryan arrived. At night, with light in the windows, it announced it itself as something that had been accumulated over a long time by people who intended to stay in it. Bookshelves floor to ceiling in the living room, organized by some system Ryan couldn't identify. A topographic map of Tennessee pinned above the kitchen table, marked in pencil. Photographs in the hallway, black and white and color together, mixed without concern, for which a couple on a porch, a younger Stephanie in what might have been high school, a man standing in front of the barn when it was new. One hand on the post nearest the door, looking directly into the camera with the expression of someone who had built something and knew it. Ryan knew who it was before he read the date in the corner. 1989. Robert Harris, the Cookville Timber. The barn that still had good bones 40 years later because the man who built it had driven 2 hours for better wood. So Stephanie made chicken pot pie, not from a box, from the ingredients in the right order, and she didn't measure anything, and Ryan could tell she'd made it many times because her attention was on everything else in the room while her hands did what they knew. Noah ate the first bowl before Stephanie sat down. Started on the second while Ryan was still working through his first. This is way better than the thing Dad makes, Ryan. I make 3 things. This isn't one of them, Stephanie. What are the 3 things, Ryan? Scrambled eggs, pasta with jarred sauces, and something with canned beans as I haven't named yet. Noah, without looking up from the bowl. He calls it situation. Stephanie looked at Noah, then at Ryan. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. Do you like dinosaurs? Noah asked her, out of nowhere. As was his way, Stephanie. Stegosaurus or Diplodocus? The pen stopped moving. Noah looked up. You know dinosaur names? I was 6 once. Noah studied her for a long moment with the full weight of his evaluation process. Then he opened the journal and wrote something. Ryan caught a glimpse. Miss Stephanie. Knows dinosaurs. Trustworthy. After Noah fell asleep on the living room couch, Biscuit arranged across his feet like a warm draft. Ryan and Stephanie stood on the porch. The fields were dark past the reach of the porch light. The oak line along the eastern boundary showed as a denser shadow against the sky. Somewhere out past the south pasture, a coyote called once and wasn't answered. Ryan had the particular low-level awareness he'd carried since the service, not paranoia. Just attention, a constant reading of an environment for what was there and what wasn't. He was aware of the scale of the land in the dark. The way 4,000 acres felt different at night than it had in the afternoon. Stephanie said, "Someone wants to buy the farm." He hadn't expected it. Not like that direct, no preamble, the way she said things when she'd decided something needed to be said. Ryan, how much land? All of it. He let that sit. Are you going to sell? She looked out at the dark where her fields were. The stillness of someone who'd already answered this question so many times it required no visible deliberation. No. Then what's the problem? She turned and looked at him. And he saw something he recognized, not the specific grief, but the specific weight. The look of someone managing more than they should be managing alone and managing it anyway. Because the alternative wasn't actually an option. The problem is he doesn't need me to agree. Ryan didn't ask who. He'd seen the black Lexus at the end of the county road twice that week. Not turning in, just pausing. The kind of pause that made itself known. The coyote called, again Clover this time. "I'll be here through the job," Ryan said. Not an offer exactly, just a fact. But she heard what he meant, because she looked at him for a moment, and then looked back at the dark fields, and something in the line of her shoulders changed slightly. Something releasing that hadn't been visible until it moved. Victor Crane arrived the following Monday at 10 in the morning. Ryan heard the car before he saw it, tires on gravel going too slow. The deliberate pace of someone making an entrance rather than arriving. He was on the barn roof, setting the first section of new decking, and he didn't come down. He watched. The Lexus was black and clean in the way things are clean when someone maintains them specifically to communicate something. The man who stepped out was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that had not been purchased within 3 counties of Clover Falls. He stood beside the car and looked at the property the way you look at something you've already decided is yours. Not at the barn. At the land, then he looked at Ryan on the roof. Ryan held the gaze. Kept working. Crane walked toward the house. Stephanie came out before he reached the porch, which meant she'd seen the car from inside and made a decision about how to meet it. She came down the steps and stopped at the bottom. Ryan couldn't hear the full conversation from the roof, but he caught registers, Crane's voice even and practiced and warm in the way of someone unaccustomed to being the most confident person in any given room. Stephanie's voice shorter, flat. Then Crane looked back at the roof, at Ryan. Nodded politely in the way a man nods at something he's already dismissed. Ryan drove a nail. When Crane spoke again, his voice carried the particular weight of something meant to travel. "You should have Carol take another look at the Year 9 clause. Just as a reminder, a pause. I'm sure she's already on it." He got back into the car, didn't rush. The Lexus turned around in the drive with geometric precision and went back down the road. Ryan came down the ladder. Stephanie was standing where Crane had left her, not watching the car, looking at the barn or past it at something that wasn't there. Her jaw set, both hands in her pockets. "Ryan, he knows you talked to your lawyer. He's known since before I made the appointment." She exhaled. "That's how he operates. He doesn't threaten you. He reminds you that he already knows everything that matters and you're working with incomplete information." "Ryan?"
"What's the Year 9 clause?"
She was quiet for 4 or 5 seconds in a way that meant she was deciding something, not forgetting it. "My father made a deal in 2015. The farm had 2 bad drought years back to back, and he needed capital. Crane provided it not as a favor, as an investment partnership with a structured buyback option. If the farm doesn't hit a certain profitability threshold in year 9 or 10, Crane has the right to purchase at 2015 market value." Ryan did the math. "And this is year 9. "Yes." She looked at the barn. "The books are negative this year because I put the capital reinvestment into the irrigation overhaul and new seed stock, which was the right call for long-term viability, and the wrong call for defending a year 9 clause. When does he move? My lawyer thinks he'll trigger the clause within the month. Once he does, I have 45 days to demonstrate sufficient profitability to void the option. Can you do that?" She looked at him directly. No performance in it, just the specific clarity of someone who has run the numbers enough times to know exactly what they say. Not with what I have right now. The afternoon light was getting long. Noah appeared around the corner of the barn with the notebook open and Biscuit at his heels, the dog carrying one of Ryan's gloves in his mouth with the proud bearing of an animal who has accomplished something significant. Ryan was going to need more gloves. He looked at Stephanie, at the farm that stretched behind her in every direction, at the woman who had been managing all of this alone since before her father was in the ground. What are you thinking about doing? She watched Noah redirect Biscuit away from the barn door. Patient with the dog the way she was patient with everything not performing it. Just not wasting energy on things that didn't require it. I have an idea, Stephanie said. But I need someone who can help with the logistics. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the barn. Ryan picked up the dropped glove, Biscuit releasing it with the air of someone relinquishing a trophy, and walked back to the ladder. Tell me the idea, he said. She told him. A farm market on the property, weekly, vendors from Clover Falls and the surrounding area, booth fees and product sales generating documented commercial revenue. Proof for Carol Thompson that the land was in active economic use. Enough to challenge the buyback trigger on the grounds that the profitability threshold was being actively contested. It was a good plan. It was her plan. She'd been building toward it for weeks. Ryan understood, assembling the pieces before she had someone to help carry them. She'd already contacted Carol Thompson 3 months ago. She'd already researched the vendor network. She'd already done the legal reading. What she needed was someone to make 22 phone calls in the evenings while she managed the fall harvest calendar. Ryan, give me the vendor list. She went inside and came back with a folded paper, names and numbers in handwriting that was small and precise. She handed it to him. I'll have confirmations by Wednesday, Ryan said. She nodded once, turned back toward the barn. He watched her go and thought about a woman who had said no to Vanderbilt and stayed and was still, 11 years later, saying no to the thing, what she had stayed for. He thought about what that kind of sustained refusal costs, how it gets into the bones. He thought about the vendor list in his hand and the calls he'd make starting tonight. Then he stopped thinking and got back to work, because the afternoon was still useful and the barn wasn't going to finish itself. The storm came from the west on a Tuesday, and Ryan saw it building at 3 in the afternoon. That particular sky, the one that goes greenish at the horizon before it goes dark, a color that has no business appearing in good weather. He'd learned to read weather in places where arriving unprepared meant something specific and permanent. Tennessee wasn't those places. But the instinct transferred completely, the way all the useful things transferred, the things that had cost something to learn. He was on the north face of the roof when the pressure dropped. Not gradually. A decision the atmosphere made all at once. The temperature fell fast enough to feel it on the back of his neck. The oaks along the eastern boundary started moving, not swaying, working, every branch against every other branch in the way trees move when wind is coming from multiple directions simultaneously, from a system that hasn't picked a single direction yet because it doesn't need to. He came down the ladder. Stephanie was already crossing the drive toward the south pasture, phone at her ear, her stride longer than her usual pace. She saw him when she was halfway across and changed direction. The herd's in the south pasture. I need them in the barn before that hits. Ryan looked at the sky. At the barn. At the north gate, the one with the loose latch he'd been planning to address Thursday. The one that had been on his list for 4 days and hadn't moved to the top because other things kept needing the top. I'll take the north fence and the gate. You bring them in from the south? She nodded once and was already moving. Ryan turned toward the barn and nearly ran into Noah coming around the corner at speed, notebook in hand, head tilted back to look at the sky with the expression of someone cataloging something extraordinary. The boy had not yet learned to read weather as threat. He still read it as information. Noah, the voice Ryan used exactly 3 times in his son's life, the voice that meant now, not after, not in a minute. Pat Moore is stopping by to pick up her delivery bowl at 4. You stay on the porch with Biscuit until she gets here. Then you stay inside with Pat. You hear me? Noah heard him. The notebook closed. Is it bad? Probably. Go. Noah went. Biscuit went with him, ears flat, reading the air. Ryan moved to the north gate and assessed the latch situation in about 4 seconds. The mechanism needed a part he didn't have on the truck. He used a length of chain from the barn store's temporary, functional, not elegant, the kind of solution that works while you work on the real solution. He looped and secured it and tested it twice and it held. He was working the fence line toward the east when the rain started. Not the tentative first drops, the full event. Sideways within 30 seconds, driven at an angle that made shelter a theoretical concept. He felt it hit the back of his collar and go immediately down his neck, and he didn't stop moving, because stopping wasn't useful. He heard the south herd before he saw them hooves on wet ground, the particular collective sound of animals that are not panicking but are moving with intention, because something they trusted was asking them to move. Stephanie had them. He could hear her voice in the rain without hearing the words, just the register, even. Continuous. The voice of someone the animals had learned to follow over time, not because of force but because she'd been consistent. He got the barn door open and held it. The herd came through. Stephanie came through a step behind the last of them, one hand on the doorframe as she cleared the threshold. Soaked entirely. A streak of mud on her left forearm where she'd caught herself on something. She looked at Ryan, then past him at the herd, and her lips moved. She was counting. Ryan watched her count every single animal and didn't say anything until she finished. When she got to the number she needed, she exhaled. He closed the barn door. The rain hit the new decking overhead like gravel thrown by a large and irritated hand. The section he'd finished held. He registered that automatically, the professional assessment running on its own track beneath everything else. The old section flexed and groaned, but it would be replaced before the next serious weather came through. He'd make certain of that. Northgate. Stephanie was already moving through the herd, checking, chained. Temporary fix. I'll do the permanent repair tomorrow morning first thing. She worked through the animals with the efficiency of long practice, checking legs, checking for stress signs, talking to them in the low continuous way she did that Ryan had noticed on his third day and filed away without comment. Not performing the talking, just doing it, the way a person thinks out loud in a space they trust. The wind hit the barn wall. The whole structure shuddered once and held. Ryan stood near the door and looked at the gap at the top, where he hadn't yet replaced the trim, the rain coming through in a thin diagonal curtain. Making his list, letting the list be useful. The east fence on the back 40, Stephanie said it without looking up from what she was doing. Section near the old water tank. It was already compromised before today, I know. If that section goes in this wind, I know. I'll check it when the worst passes. She looked up at him then. The specific check not doubting the statement but verifying whether he meant it or was saying it to stop her from thinking about it. Two different things. She'd learned to tell them apart. He met her eyes. He meant it. She went back to the herd. The worst of it passed in 40 minutes. What replaced it was the kind of rain that was merely rain, still heavy, still cold, but no longer angry about it. Ryan went out and found the east fence the way he'd expected to find it. 20 feet of wire pulled free, draped across the wet grass. The wooden posts snapped at the base by a combination of wind load and pre-existing weakness that had been waiting for exactly this kind of occasion to make itself known. Not catastrophic, entirely repairable, but it needed to happen tomorrow, not next week. He went back to the barn. Stephanie was sitting on an overturned bucket near the far wall, one knee up, the other leg stretched out. Looking at the floor with the fixed attention of a person not actually looking at anything, running something through their head. Replaying it, checking it for exits. Ryan sat on the workbench 6 feet away. Not crowding the space, just in it, she said. The north section of the roof. The part you haven't finished, it moved but it held. I'll be up there first thing, before the gate repair. She nodded. Still at the floor, Stephanie, she looked up. What else? Because there was a something else. He could read the shape of it in the set of her jaw, the deliberate placement of her hands. The look of someone who has been carrying something at a controlled pace and has just enough left to keep carrying it, but not quite enough to pretend the weight isn't there. She looked back at the floor. Then, Crane sent a second letter today. Before the storm, Ryan waited. He's accelerating. 45 days was the outer limit. He can move faster if he chooses, and his lawyer indicated he intends to. Carol thinks we have closer to 30 days. Ryan ran the math. The market needed setup time, vendor coordination, a date far enough out that people could plan. He'd made 11 of the vendor calls, 6 confirmed, 2 Mabes, he needed all 22 and then some. We can run the market in 2 weekends. She looked at him. That's fast. It has to be. Not to alarm her. Just a fact about the timeline. I can finish the remaining calls by Friday. Earl, does he have personal relationships with any of the vendors on that list? She thought about it. Probably half of them. Ask him to call the other 5. Don't frame it as a favor. Just tell him what you're doing and why, and let him decide what to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Earl doesn't do things because you ask him. He does things because they make sense to him. Show him it makes. She considered this for several seconds. Not performing the consideration, actually running it, then, you're right. Simple as that. No qualifier, no modification. Ryan had met very few people who could receive an idea they hadn't generated and accept it cleanly, without needing to reshape it first before saying yes to it. All of them had been worth knowing. They stayed in the barn until the rain dropped below useful work threshold. Then Ryan secured the herd, checked the chain on the north gate one more time, and walked back to the guest house in the last of the evening light. Noah was on the porch with the Pat Moore, who had not left when the storm arrived, and who had apparently spent the intervening 2 hours teaching Noah a card game that Ryan had never heard of, and that Noah was now winning with suspicious consistency. Pat looked at Ryan, then at the state of his clothing, then back at his face. Is it bad? East fence section. I'll fix it tomorrow. Is Stephanie all right? She's fine. Pat looked at him for a beat longer than the question required. Then she said, good, and turned back to the card game. Ryan went inside, changed into dry clothes, and made the remaining vendor calls from the kitchen table, while Noah beat Pat Moore at cards for another 45 minutes, and Biscuit slept through all of it on the guest house rug, with the profound unconsciousness of an animal who had no outstanding concerns. Earl came the next morning without being called, 7:15. Ryan was already on the east fence. Had been since 6 because the gate repair had taken less time than he'd allowed for it, and the morning light was good, and the fence wasn't going to fix itself. Earl's truck rolled in and parked, and Earl got out and walked to where Ryan was working without any preamble about the storm or the damage or the situation generally. He looked at the snap posts Ryan had already pulled, looked at the new posts stacked beside the truck, looked at the wire, 40-pound galvanized or 50. Ryan, 50. Earl made the sound that meant he agreed but wasn't going to announce it. He picked up the other end of the fence wire and held it at the correct tension, without being told what correct tension was, which meant he'd done this kind of work for a long time and had his own assessment of what it should be. Ryan drove the first staple. They worked down the line without discussing it, Earl adjusting when Ryan adjusted, reading the work the way experienced people read each other in physical tasks, through the material itself rather than through conversation. When they reached the second post, Earl said, Crane sent a letter, not a question. Ryan, how do you know? Mitch Fuller at the county assessor's office mentioned to his wife that someone had requested updated parcel valuations on the Harris property. His wife mentioned it to Pat Moore. Pat mentioned it to me last night at 9 o'clock because Pat believes 9 o'clock is an appropriate time to call people. Ryan drove a staple, passed the tool back. We know about the letter. What's the plan? Ryan told him about the market, the vendor calls, the documentation Carol needed, the timeline. Earl listened without interrupting, the way Earl listened to everything with the patient attention of someone who doesn't need to demonstrate that they're listening because the listening is obvious. When Ryan finished, Earl was quiet for a beat. Then, Jimmy Carver hasn't confirmed. He's a maybe. I've called twice. Earl reached into his shirt pocket without looking away from the fence line, pulled out a phone that was approximately as old as the truck, walked 15 feet away and made a call. Ryan kept working. When Earl came back, he picked up the fence wire at the correct tension again. Jimmy's confirmed, he said. The way you say something that was never actually in doubt. Ryan drove another staple. That afternoon, Earl sat on the farmhouse porch with Stephanie for 45 minutes. Ryan was in the barn finishing the rafter work that the storm had pushed back, and he didn't hear what they said. But when Stephanie came into the barn afterward, there was something different in how she was holding herself. Not relaxed. Something better than relaxed, the specific quality of a person whose running calculation has just resolved one of its major uncertainties. Earl's signing a renewal on the purchase contract, she said. He's been operating on an annual verbal with my dad since the written contract lapsed years ago. He said he should have put it in writing a long time ago, or free. She looked at the new rafter work overhead at the section that had held through the storm. Carol can use that as evidence of active commercial agricultural use. It goes directly to the profitability argument, and Ryan, good, he said my father never needed a piece of paper, and so Earl didn't write one. She paused. He said I'm in a different situation. He's right. He usually is. She looked at the rafter work again. He just usually doesn't say it, Ryan. He said it when it mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to the house, and Ryan went back to the rafters. And the afternoon moved forward with the particular momentum of things that have stopped being theoretical and started being actual. What changed in the second week, the week after the storm, was that Stephanie started working alongside him differently. Not just appearing with coffee and the occasional measurement question. Physically alongside for hours at a time. Holding the opposing end of a beam while he secured it, steadying the ladder from below, passing tools up with the accuracy of someone attention to what need paying attention to he watching for before he reached for it, before it. She wasn't trained and she didn't pretend to be, but she was strong and precise, and she absorbed information through watching rather than asking, which meant she never needed the same thing explained twice. Ryan noticed. Didn't say anything about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, braced against a rafter at 8 feet with her holding the opposing end, he said, most landowners I've worked for stand at the edge and comment on things. Stephanie, without inflection, I noticed. Is that why you're not doing it? I'm not doing it because standing at the edge isn't useful. He was quiet for a moment. Then, fair, she didn't smile. But her hold on the rafter settled differently, from careful to comfortable, from proving something to just doing it. That was the thing about Stephanie Harris that Ryan was learning slowly, the way you learn things that matter, which is by accumulation rather than event. Every shift was small. Every door opened a centimeter at a time. You had to be paying attention to see it move. One afternoon toward the end of the second week, the light going long and orange over the western tree line, neither of them moving toward their respective ends of the day with any urgency, they ended up at the split rail fence at the edge of the south pasture, while Noah catalogued something in the notebook 40 feet away. Biscuit conducted an investigation of a fence post that had been offending him in some way for several days. Ryan had been in situations like this before. The particular stillness after the work is done and before the rest of the evening reasserts its obligations. The window where two people can say something or not say anything, and both options are equally available. She chose not. He didn't choose that this time. Did you want to leave? He said. When you were young, Stephanie didn't look at him. I had a scholarship offer. Architecture. Vanderbilt, that stopped him. Why didn't you take it? A pause. The kind that means the answer exists and has been organized in advance. My mother passed the spring of my senior year. My father needed someone here, a beat, and I wanted to be needed here. Those two things were both true at the same time. Your brother didn't stay. The pause this time was longer. Different in quality, the specific texture of a sentence that holds more than it releases. Dean had his own direction. Ryan didn't push it. He recognized the shape of a thing that had been considered many times and filed in a place that didn't require daily access. Do you regret it? He wasn't sure why, he asked. It wasn't tactically necessary, but the answer felt like accurate information, the kind he wanted. She was quiet long enough that he thought she'd decided not to answer. No. She turned and looked at him then. Direct, the way she looked at everything she'd decided about. People think a woman who gave something up must be grieving it. But giving something up for something you chose, that's not grief. That's just choosing. Ryan looked at the fields. The gold going out of them, the light leaving. I enlisted at 20. People asked me this same kind of question. Like the choice must have come from not knowing any better, he paused. I knew what I was doing. I was a person who needed to go somewhere that required everything I had, Stephanie. Was it worth it? He thought about it honestly. Not the answer he'd given other people, but the actual accounting. Parts of it. Parts of it cost things I didn't know I was spending at the time. She nodded. Not with pity, with the specific recognition of someone who understands that some costs only become visible in retrospect, after the purchase is already complete. Noah appeared at the fence rail. Dad, Biscuit found something, Ryan. Is it something that should be found? Noah, probably not. Ryan pushed off the fence and went to manage whatever Biscuit had decided required excavation, which turned out to be a ground squirrel hole that the dog had apparently taken as a personal challenge and an affront to his dignity. Stephanie walked toward the house, and Ryan tracked her across the yard without intending to. The way she moved through the fading light, the way she stopped once near the south field to look at something, hands in her pockets, head tilted slightly, reading the pasture the way she read the barn or the fence line or anything she was responsible for, like she was taking attendance, like she needed to know it was still there. Dean Harris arrived on a Thursday morning, not in a vehicle that matched the version of himself he'd apparently been performing in Memphis for the past 12 years. A rental car, silver and anonymous, the back seat visible through the window, holding nothing but a single overnight bag. He parked neatly in the drive, which Ryan noticed from the barn roof, where he was finishing the last section of new decking, the final piece of the roof work, the part that completed the job structurally, the part he'd been looking forward to and dreading in equal measure. Stephanie's coloring arranged in a different order. He'd made some effort to dress for a farm, the suit jacket exchanged for a fleece that still had the fold marks in it, which told you the effort had been recent and somewhat theoretical. He looked at the farmhouse, at the barn, at Ryan on the roof. Ryan looked back and kept working. Dean went to the house. 20 minutes passed. Ryan finished the decking section, came down the ladder. Did the walkthrough of the completed roof, every section, every connection, the professional closure of a job that was now structurally complete, even if the cosmetic work remained. The barn was done. Functionally, structurally, in the ways that would matter in 40 years when someone stood in it and pressed their knuckles against the posts and heard what dzud wood sounds like. He was coming out of the barn when Stephanie came out of the house. She wasn't moving the way she usually moved. Slower, with the particular quality of motion that belongs to someone who has just sat through something more than they'd budgeted for. She walked to the south fence, stood there. Ryan walked to the fence and stood 6 feet from her and waited. Crane contacted Dean. He'd expected that much. Dean has 30% of the property in the estate agreement. Crane explained to him that with the buyback clause active, Dean's portion becomes complicated to manage separately. He suggested it would be cleaner, more profitable for Dean to consolidate before the deadline. Her hands were on the top rail, pressed flat against the wood. Crane offered Dean a side premium, 20% above the 2015 assessed value on his portion. Ryan, that's real money. Yes. What did Dean say? She turned her head slightly. Not enough to look at him directly. He said I should consider it. The silence after that had a specific weight. The kind that comes from a sentence that someone said with the intention of being reasonable and it landed as something else entirely. Yes. Ryan had been in situations where the wrong thing said caused damage that took a long time to repair. He'd also been in situations where the right thing said changed nothing at all. He'd learned the difference, slowly, over years of being in rooms with people who were handling more than their stated capacity. This was not the moment for a plan. Is Dean still in the house? Yes. Do you want to go back in? A long pause. Then, not yet. He stayed at the fence. She stayed at the fence. The south pasture settled in the mid-afternoon quiet, the herd near the waterline, the light going soft over the western grass. Eventually, Stephanie said, he left when he was 22. I was 19. My mother had been gone a year. My father had already taken on the Crane investment to cover the second drought year. She paused. Dean said the farm was his ceiling. He said he needed more than a ceiling. Ryan, what did your father say? He said that's fine, and he meant it. He wasn't a man who needed people to stay in places they didn't want to be. Another pause, but he needed the farm to work. And Dean leaving meant it was the two of us, and then it was just me. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then, he wasn't wrong that he needed to leave. She looked at him. People need what they need. That doesn't make what he's doing now okay. Those are two different things. She turned back to the pasture, but her hands on the rail released slightly. Just slightly. Dean came out of the house 40 minutes later and found them both at the fence. He looked at Ryan with the particular wariness of a man who doesn't know which category to put someone in and is aware that the wrong category assignment could be costly. Ryan didn't make it easier for him. Dean, I should introduce myself, Ryan. Ryan Clark. I'm doing the barn restoration. Dean looked at the barn, at his sister, then at Ryan again with a recalibration happening somewhere behind his eyes. Right. He turned to Stephanie. I'm not saying you have to decide today, Stephanie. I'm not deciding to sell. That's not the decision I'm making, Dean. Then what are you deciding? She's shoulders level. Chin up. Not aggressive, just entirely without apology. I'm deciding how to beat the claws. That's the only decision on the table. If you want to help with that, tell me. If you're here to explain Crane's position to me, I've heard it from him directly. Dean was quiet. The farm held the silence around them. Birds somewhere in the oak line. The low distant sound of the herd then. What do you need? A beat. Ryan saw the small adjustment. Stephanie made the barely visible recalibration of how much to let in. She didn't reach for it. She let it arrive. I need to know you're not signing anything with Crane. That's the first thing, Dean. I haven't signed anything, then don't. Not until this plays out. She held his eyes. After that, whatever you decide about your portion is yours to decide. But not while this is active. Dean looked at the farm, at the house where he'd grown up, at the barn with its completed roof, the new sections bright against the weathered red of the old ones. Okay, he said one word. Small and overfull, and neither of them elaborated on it, which was correct. Some agreements are more complete when they're not explained. Dean stayed for dinner. Pat Moore arrived at the same time, with leftover biscuits from that morning, and managed to fill every potential silence in the kitchen with something that required a response, which Ryan suspected was entirely intentional and which he was grateful for in a way he didn't examine closely. Noah explained the detective journal to Dean with complete thoroughness, including the Zone 7 incident and its aftermath and the current status of Biscuit's relationship with the henhouse, which was one of surface distance. Dean laughed in the hasn't laughed genuinely in longer than they'd realized. And for 20 minutes, the kitchen was simply a kitchen with people in it who were not in conflict. Ryan watched it and thought about the cost of estrangement. Not the dramatic kind, the slow kind, the accumulated kind, the kind that happens when you leave a place cleanly and then find out years later that you left parts of yourself that's you didn't notice were missing until you sat at the same table again. And someone laughed. Dean left after dinner. He didn't announce a decision. But he didn't mention Crane again. And he said good night to Stephanie in a way that wasn't the way you say good night to someone you're in the process of disappointing. Noah got sick on a Sunday night, a fever 103.2 when Ryan first checked it, dropping to 101.8 2 hours later. The kind that runs bright and fast in children and is miserable and temporary. Ryan knew the difference between sick and sick. He knew this was not the version that required the emergency room. He sat beside Noah's bed all night anyway, because he always did. Because when Noah's 3 and running 104. 4 and Ryan had been unreachable, a forward operating base with communications down. And his mother had been the one to take Noah to hospital when Ryan had finally gotten through on a borrowed satellite phone 14 hours later and heard Noah's voice on the line, small and hoarse, and saying daddy the way a child says it when they've been scared and are pretending not to have been after that. Ryan sat at the bed, every time, without calculation. It was not a decision he made each time. It was simply what happened. He was still in the chair at 6 a.m. when he heard the back door of the main house open and footsteps cross the yard. A knock, quiet. The knock of someone checking whether you're awake rather than announcing an emergency. He dawdled. He opened the door. Stephanie was holding the blue enamel pot from the back left burner of her stove. The smell that came with it was chicken broth and thyme and something else he couldn't identify and didn't need to. Pat told me Noah was running a fever. Ryan, Pat doesn't know that. Pat knows everything. Noah told Biscuit. Biscuit was sitting outside your door when Pat came to pick up her bowl from yesterday. Pat drew the correct conclusion. Ryan looked at her. She held the pot up slightly. Broth and crackers. He doesn't have to eat it. He stepped back and let her in. She left the pot on the small stove in the guest house kitchen, left the crackers on the counter, looked in on Noah through the open bedroom door asleep, color better than it had been at midnight, and then sat down at the kitchen table. Not to leave immediately. Ryan made coffee because there was coffee and it was 6 a.m. and he had not slept. He put a mug in front of her and sat across from her. They didn't talk for a while. The farm coming awake outside Zedbird's first. then the far-off sound of the herd, then the particular creak of the old oak by the eastern fence that moved in any sustained wind. Ryan, when Deb died I was deployed. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things come out at 6 in the morning after a night of not sleeping without the usual architecture of decision around them. She was driving home from her sister's. Highway 70. A truck ran a red light. He looked at his coffee. Noah was home with my mother. He was 3. He didn't understand what had happened for a long time. Maybe he still doesn't, not fully. He paused. I got the call on a 14-hour delay. Communications had been down. I listened to the voicemail in an equipment yard with my back against a wall and the sun coming up on the wrong side of the world. Stephanie hadn't moved. I flew home 4 days later. Did everything you do, and then I went back. Because I had 6 months remaining and going back was the only thing I knew how to do. He turned the mug. That's not something I'm proud of. It's what happened, Stephanie said. You came back. Eventually, Noah is fine. He's better than fine. He's the best person I know. A pause. But I've been late to things I didn't mean to be late to. And there's no accounting for that. You'd carry it. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the oak moved. The birds kept going. My mother died during finals week my senior year, she said. I drove home the same day. Didn't take my exams. Didn't call the school for almost a week because I couldn't make myself do it. She looked at her hands around the mug. When I told Vanderbilt I wasn't coming, they asked if I was sure. I said yes. I have never once told anyone I wasn't. A pause. But there are evenings when I walk the south field and I think about what I might have built somewhere else. What I might have designed. Her eyes came up to his. Not sad, not wistful. Honest, which was something different and more difficult. And then I think about this field and I don't feel like I made a mistake. I feel like I made a trade, a hard one. And it was mine to make. Ryan looked at her for a moment, then said, yeah, just that. But he meant it as recognition of everything she'd said, and she understood, because she nodded once and looked back at her coffee, and they sat there while the farm woke up around them. And Noah slept in the next room, and the broth stayed warm on the stove, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was necessary. He found the email 3 days after Noah's fever broke, 11 p.m. He'd been finishing the vendor coordination spreadsheet at the kitchen table, the one Carol had asked for, as part of the documentation package: vendor names, booth fees, projected attendance, signed agreements where he had them. His phone was on the counter and he checked it for no particular reason at 11:07, and there it was, Marsh & Cole Construction, Atlanta. Subject, your application position available. He'd applied to Marsh & Cole 4 months ago, before Knoxville, before the Veterans Forum and the listing in Clover Falls. They built commercial structures and high-end residential, and the kind of projects that required someone who understood structural carpentry and project management as a single skill rather than 2 separate ones. It was exactly his background. It paid significantly more than barn restoration in rural Tennessee. They wanted a site foreman on a long-term development project starting in January. Full benefits. Housing stipend for the first 6 months. Guaranteed work for a minimum of 18 months. Ryan put the phone face down on the counter. He sat with the face-down phone for a while. Atlanta wasn't impossible. 6 hours. Noah could start school in January with the same kids through the end of the year and have a bedroom that didn't change address every few months. Ryan could stop doing the math on weekly cash positions and whether the next job was close enough to the current housing situation to make it work or whether he'd need to move again. He could stop moving, or at least move to something that stayed in one place long enough to call itself stable. He turned the phone over. Read the email again. Same offer. Same case for yes. He put it down and didn't open the reply window. He told Noah the next morning because Noah was his son and these were decisions that affected Noah's life and Ryan didn't make them unilaterally. That was the agreement he'd made with himself and with the memory of Deb and with the specific fact of being a father. Noah got information. Not every kind. Not all at once, but the kind that mattered. They sat on the guest house steps before breakfast. Early, the way their best conversations happened before the day had fully started. When they were both still in the quiet of it, Ryan read him the relevant parts. Location. Start date. What it would mean in terms of where they lived. Noah listened with the detective journal in his lap, which meant he was processing rather than just hearing. When Ryan finished, Noah looked out at the farm. at the barn with the new decking catching the early light at a different angle than the old sections. At the oak line he'd drawn 11 times from 11 different angles. At the south pasture where Biscuit was conducting his morning investigation of the fence post situation. I want to stay here, Ryan. Tell me why. Because with Noah you asked, not to challenge the answer, to understand it. Noah thought about it with the seriousnesses he brought to things that deserved seriousness, which was most things. Because the map's not done. Zone 11 still doesn't have labels. A pause. And because Biscuit has a friend with the collie dog and I don't think he'll be okay if he has to leave a friend again. Another pause shorter. And because you laugh here. Like actually laugh. Not just when something is funny. Ryan looked at the farm. You laugh here? Like actually laugh. He didn't say anything for a long time. The morning moved around them, the birds, the oak, the far sound of the herd beginning to move toward the south water. I'm not replying today, he said finally. Noah, okay, I'm going to think about it. Noah opened the journal to a page Ryan couldn't see and started adding something to the Zone 11 map. Okay, he said again. Content. Trusting, in the way a child trusts a parent who has consistently come back when he said he would. That the thinking would find its way to the right place. Ryan sat with that trust for a moment. The weight of it. The way it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever extended to him and the most demanding. He picked up his coffee. Looked at the barn. He did not open the email reply window that day. Or the day after, on the third day, Earl Booker called at 2 in the afternoon, which was unusual enough that Ryan answered on the first ring. Earl, I've been thinking about Crane, Ryan. All right, he's going to show up at the market. He'll come because he wants to see whether it's enough. And he'll come because he wants Stephanie to feel his presence there, on her own land, on the day she thinks she's winning. A pause, Earl length. He's been working this county for 12 years. He knows the legal piece and the psychological piece are different things, and both of them matter. Ryan, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you that the market needs to be the kind of event a man like Crane looks at and understands the community is not on his side. Not just vendors, not just customers. Another pause. I have some calls to make that aren't on your list, Ryan. Earl, what? Thank you. The pause on Earl's end had a different quality than his usual ones. Then he said, Robert Harris's barn is standing because Robert Harris used good timber and someone is fixing it right. The line went quiet. Ryan set the phone down on the guest house table. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what October light did in Tennessee, going long and gold and making everything it touched look like the most important version of itself. He picked up the vendor spreadsheet, added Earl's calls to the confirmed column, went back to work. That evening, after Noah was in bed and Biscuit was arranged across the foot of it in his self-appointed role as security detail, Ryan sat at the guest house table with the layout map and the spreadsheet and the list and looked at what they'd all built over the past 3 weeks, 22 vendors. Earl's procurement renewal, Carol's documentation framework, Dean's stated non-participation, one farm in one small county holding its ground against a man with a legal instrument and the patience to use it. He looked at the layout map for a long time. Then he looked at the farm through the guesthouse window, at the dark shape of the barn against the night sky, the new roof section a slightly different silhouette than the old, at the oak line, at the main house where the kitchen light was still on because Stephanie was still at the table with the documentation folder, had been since 9 would probably be there until midnight. He thought about the email. He thought about what Noah had said on the steps. He thought about what it meant that he'd been driving down this road every morning for 3 weeks after a job that was structurally complete and nobody had said a word about it. Not Stephanie, not Earl, not Pat Moore. Who said a word about everything. He didn't open the reply window. He folded the layout map, left it on the table where Stephanie would find it in the morning, and went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the Tennessee farm, holding itself through the night. Patient and stubborn, the way everything here seemed to hold without drama, without announcement, just with the accumulated weight of having been here for a long time and intending to stay. Part 2 word count, approximately 5,100 words across 5 sections. Note, Tarhat is minimum 9,500 words, continuing directly to extend each section to meet required count. The morning after the storm, Earl walked the repaired east fence with Ryan before the dew had fully lifted. Not inspecting it, Earl had already verified the work the afternoon before by walking past it twice and saying nothing, which Ryan had learned meant it was acceptable. This was something else. Earl walking with his hands in his pockets and the toothpick working and his eyes moving over the property the way they moved over it every time he was on it. The survey of a man who has been watching a particular piece of land for a long time and notices changes. They reached the core post and Earl stopped. Looked at the repaired section. Looked at the old wire joining the new. Robert used to do that, Earl said. Walked the fence after a storm. Didn't matter what time it was or what else needed doing. Fence first, Ryan. Good habit. It's not a habit if you don't think about it. Earl looked at the old wire. He did it because the fence being right was the thing that let everything else work. Animals in, the wrong animals out. The shape of the land staying the shape it was so supposed to be. He paused. Some things are like that. You don't notice them when they're right. You only notice when they fail. Ryan looked at the fence line extending east toward the oak boundary. Then at the barn visible over Earl's left shoulder, the new roof section bright in the morning light. Earl turned and walked back toward the drive. They didn't say anything else. But something had been said, and Ryan carried it with him through the rest of the morning while he worked on the exterior trim, around the barn's north door, the cosmetic work, the final layer, the part that would make the repair invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, which was, in its own way, the point. By the end of the second week, Stephanie had contacted the Techni's 6 additional potential vendors that weren't on the original list people she'd thought of in the middle of the night, and written down on the notepad she kept on the kitchen table, the one that also had farm management notes, and Carol Thompson's phone number at the top of the first page. She handed Ryan the additions without comment, and he called them the next evening, and all 6 confirmed, 28 vendors. Carol Thompson called the following Thursday evening while Ryan was on the guesthouse porch doing the final reconciliation of the spreadsheet. Stephanie took the call in the main house. Ryan could see the kitchen light through the window, the shadow of her moving back and forth the way she moved when she was on the phone about something important, not exactly. More like keeping herself in motion so the information had somewhere to go. The call lasted 19 minutes. When it was over, Stephanie walked across the yard and stood at the bottom of the guesthouse steps. Ryan, what did she say? She think the documentation we have is strong. The Earl contract, the vendor agreements, the attendance projections. She said the critical piece is the day itself, the actual receipts, the actual headcount, the actual document commercial activity. She looked at the spreadsheet in his hands. She said if we can demonstrate consistent weekly activity, not just one event, that's the strongest argument against the buyback trigger, Ryan. Consistent weekly, she said even 2 weeks in a row shows intent. 3 weeks demonstrates pattern, then we're running it 3 weekends minimum. Stephanie looked at him. You're still planning to be here in 3 weeks, not a question. Not quite a statement. Something in between the specific register of a sentence that is testing something without wanting to appear to be testing it. Ryan looked at the spreadsheet, then at the farm, then at her. Yeah, he said. I am. She held that for a moment. Then she went back to the main house, and the kitchen light stayed on for another 2 hours while she went through the documentation folder, and Ryan finished the sheet, and the farm held them both in its particular patient way, the way it held everything without preference, without rush, just with the weight of having been here long enough that another pair of people working late in the dark was simply part of what it did. Noah, it turned out, had been collecting information about Victor Crane from sources Ryan hadn't accounted for. This came out on a Saturday afternoon when Noah presented Ryan with a page from the detective journal that contained what the boy called a profile. It included name, Victor Crane, comes in a black car, always has a nice suit, doesn't look at people when he talks to them, looks at the land, has visited 4 times, never stays long. Mrs. Stephanie's shoulders go different when she sees his car. Ryan read this twice. Where did you get this? Noah, observations. Also, Pat told me some things when she thought I wasn't listening, which I was. Ryan, Pat knows you listen to everything. Noah, probably. She said, Mr. Crane has been buying land all over this county for 12 years, and this is the first time someone has told him no twice and meant it. Ryan jotted the journal page down. You shouldn't build files on people. Noah, it's not a file. It's a profile. For the case, Ryan. What case? Noah looked at him with the expression he used when Ryan asked questions with obvious answers. The case of Miss Stephanie's farm. I'm helping, Ryan. How are you helping? I'm documenting, Noah said. Every good investigation needs documentation. Ryan looked at his son for a long moment, at the curly hair and the serious eyes, and the notebook that went everywhere, and the absolute unshakable conviction that paying attention to things was a form of participation in them. Don't let Crane see the journal, Ryan said. No, obviously. He went back to documenting. The morning of the market came in cold and clear, that particular October clarity that makes Tennessee look like someone adjusted the light sky too blue. The grass still green at the base where the frost hadn't reached yet, the maple line along the county road burning hard orange and red against all that blue. Ryan was outside before 5, not because he'd set an alarm, because he hadn't slept past 4:30, and lying there had stopped being useful somewhere around 4:15. He walked the setup in the dark with a flashlight. 28 stalls. 2 rows running perpendicular to the barn, using the natural funnel of the drive to pull people in, and then opening into the main yard where the larger vendor tents were anchored with stakes he'd driven himself Thursday evening, while Stephanie reviewed the documentation folder with Carol on the phone, and Noah drew the final version of the Zone 11 map by lamplight. He checked every anchor stake, every canopy connection, every folding table that he and Earl had carried out of the Harris barn storage the night before. He tested each one with a hand on the frame, and his weight shifted slightly into it, the way you test things when it matters whether they hold. Everything held. He stood in the middle of the empty market at 5:15 and looked at what they'd built. 28 vendors. Earl's procurement contract in the documentation folder, Dean's written statement of non-participation in any Crane transaction, notarized Thursday afternoon at a place in town that Dean had driven 45 minutes to reach because it was the only notary open that day. 11 weeks of full harvest receipts that Stephanie had pulled from the farm's accounting files, after Carol told her exactly what documentation threshold required. Every piece accounted for enough, probably enough. Carol had said probably, which Ryan understood was as definitive as Carol allowed herself to get when the opposing party had a valid legal instrument and the patience to use it. He folded the flashlight and went to make coffee. The vendors started arriving at 7. Pat Moore came first. Her station wagon loaded in a way that suggested she'd started baking at midnight, which she had Ryan found this out later from Noah, who had found it out from Pat directly, which told you something about the information-sharing protocols Pat operated under. She drove in with the confidence of someone who had claimed the best stall position weeks ago and intended to occupy it at the earliest possible moment. She unloaded without asking for help until she needed a second pair of hands for the tent frame, at which point she said Ryan's name, not as a request, as an assignment, and he came over and held the frame while she drove the stakes with an efficiency that made him feel briefly redundant. Is Stephanie up? Ryan. She was up before me. Good. She needs to eat something. She won't, so someone needs to put food in front of her, Ryan. That's probably not it's everyone's job when someone won't take care of themselves. She drove the last stake, stepped back and assessed the tent with the critical eye of someone who had set up this particular configuration many times and knew what acceptable looked like. Earl called me this morning, Ryan. What time? 4:45. He wanted to confirm the carver table was in the correct position. I told him yes. She picked up her first display box. He also said he made some additional calls this week that he didn't mention to either of you, Ryan. What kind of calls? He said the kind that needed making. She arranged the first row of goods without looking up. With Earl. That's all the explanation you're going to get. Ryan filed that and went back to the layout. By 8, 14 vendors were set up. By 8:30, all 28. The farm smelled like coffee and baked goods and dried botanicals from the wreath vendor in stall 9, and something savory from the preserves, 2 rows over, that was already drawing people across the yard before the market had officially opened. Ryan walked the rows one final time, making the small adjustments, a tent angle here, a sign position there, and then he let it be what it was. Stefani was everywhere. That was the only accurate description. She was at the entry talking to Jimmy Carver about extension cord routing. She was at the documentation table where Carol had sent a paralegal to sit with the folder and a receipt book and a printed copy of the relevant contract clause. She was at the field edge talking to Earl and two men Ryan hadn't met, neighbors, he gathered, farm owners from the adjacent county who had the same particular quality of presence that Earl had, the quality of people who have worked a specific piece of land for a long time and carry the weight of it in their posture. She was managing all of it without appearing to manage anything. Moving between conversations, answering questions, redirecting problems before they needed to be called problems. Doing the thing she was best at, which was also the thing she'd never had to name because it had simply always been what she did, making people feel like the farm was partly theirs, like being here mattered in a way that extended beyond the transaction. Ryan watched her for a moment. She hadn't asked for any of this to be recognized. She probably wouldn't have known what to do with recognition if it arrived, so he didn't offer it. He went to verify that the entry table had a sign, and that the sign said what it was supposed to say. By 9:30, the crowd was larger than his conservative estimate of 150. By 9:30, there were already 100 in the yard. By 10, there were more cars on the county road than the overflow grass could absorb, and Earl materialized from somewhere with two of the neighboring farm hands and began directing traffic with the authority of someone who has never once in his life needed a vest or a flag to communicate that he was in charge of something. Noah was in his element. This was the thing about his son that Ryan had stopped being surprised by and started being simply grateful for. The boy was careful with new rooms, new people, the first 5 minutes of any situation. And then something switched, and he became the small person going from stall to stall, with the detective journal asking vendors questions they had not anticipated being asked. What did you name your first cow? How many pounds of honey does one hive produce in a year? Do you think flowers remember what season they're planted in? The wreath vendor Margaret, 50-some years old, with the hands of someone who worked with wire and dried botanicals daily, spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between dried and preserved flowers, while Noah drew the wreath structure in the journal, with the focused accuracy of a small cartographer. Biscuit sat beside them with the patient attention of a dog who had decided this particular vendor was probably going to drop something interesting eventually. Ryan ran his periodic check, the sweep of his eyes across the yard to locate the curly dark head, confirm the motion, move on. The check that had become automatic in the first year after Deb. The thing he did without knowing he was doing it. At 10:45, he did the sweep and didn't find Noah for 20 seconds. 20 seconds. That's all it was. And then the curly head appeared from behind the produce table, Biscuit at his heels, notebook open and pen moving, and Noah entirely absorbed in a conversation about sweet potato varieties with Earl's neighbor, a man named Gerald who had the kind of patience with children that comes from having raised several. Ryan went over and put his hand briefly on Noah's shoulder without interrupting. Noah patted his hand without looking up and kept talking about sweet potatoes. Ryan went back to the layout. Victor Crane arrived at 12:53. Ryan had expected 1 o'clock. Crane was a man who liked arriving after things had already happened, when the evidence was visible and the argument for dismissing it had to be constructed rather than preempted. 12:53 was close enough to his pattern to confirm it wasn't accidental. The Lexus rolled in slowly and stopped at the edge of the overflow grass because there was nowhere else to go. The overflow situation being the most concrete possible proof of the morning's success. 191 people in the yard by Ryan's noon count, with the afternoon crowd still arriving in steady ones and twos and families. Crane stepped out. No tea today. The one concession to setting. Everything else, the suit, the posture, the deliberate pace, exactly the same as every time before. He stood beside the car and looked at the market with an expression Ryan hadn't seen from him before. Not the amused dismissal of his first visit. Not the polished confidence of the let-delivery visit. He was calculating. Ryan watched him do it. Because Crane was genuinely good at what he did, that had always been evident even from the roof from the first day. He was reading the crowd, counting the vendor stalls, looking at the documentation table where Carol's paralegal sat with the receipt book that now contained 163 transactions. He was running his own numbers against the ones he'd prepared. Ryan moved to the gate, Crane saw him when he was 30 feet out. Something in Crane's face adjusted, not surprise. He'd known Ryan would be here. But something about Ryan standing at the gate specifically, rather than in the yard, made him pause for one stride. Then he came forward. Ryan. Mr. Crane. Mr. Clark, the appreciative pause of a chess player acknowledging a well-placed piece. Impressive turnout, Ryan. Yes, is this going to be a weekly thing, Ryan? That's the plan. Crane looked past him at the market, at the vendors, the families, the children running between the stalls, at Earl, who was currently redirecting a family with a stroller toward the honey table and who had his back to the gate, at Stephanie, 40 feet away at the documentation table, who had seen Crane's car arrive and not too toward him had not moved away from him. She was holding her ground by doing exactly what she'd been doing all morning. Ryan had noticed the car. She'd given one small nod, barely a movement, and kept talking to the family in front of her. Crane. The documentation you're building. It's not nothing, Ryan. No, Carol Thompson is competent. She'll file it correctly. A pause. The pause of someone choosing the next sentence from several available options. It still depends on how the profitability threshold reads, whether it looks like genuine commercial activity or a one-time construction designed to satisfy a specific legal standard. Ryan. Ask any vendor here if they're coming back next week. Crane held his gaze, because he couldn't do that and dispute the result. Because the market hadn't been built to look like a market, it was a market, and the people in it were there because of relationships. Stephanie Harris had been maintaining for 11 years without cashing them because she hadn't needed to until now. You couldn't manufacture that with logistics. You either had it or you didn't, and Crane was standing in front of the proof that she had it. He understood that. Ryan could see him understanding it, the small precise adjustment of a man who is revising an estimate. Crane. I'll be in touch with Carol, Ryan. That's between you and Carol. Crane looked at the market once more. Then he turned, walked back to the Lexus at the same unhurried pace, and got in. The car pulled out of the drive the way it had entered, slowly, deliberately. The exit of a man who controls the tempo of his departures, because the tempo is the last thing he can control. Ryan watched until the car was gone around the bend. Then he turned back to the market. Earl Booker was standing 6 feet behind him, toothpick rotating, hands in pockets, having materialized from somewhere with no discernible sound of approach. Ryan, were you there the whole time? Earl, long enough, Ryan. What did you think? Earl looked at the county road where the Lexus had gone, then at the market, then at Ryan with the specific directness he used when he was saying something that needed to land accurately. He's not coming back, Earl said. Not hope, not encouragement, the flat observation of a man reading weather. He walked back toward the produce tables without waiting for a response. Ryan stood at the gate for a moment longer. He thought about the email in his phone, the offer from Atlanta that he still hadn't replied to, the position that started in January, that paid well, that offered the stability he'd been constructing a case for since Noah was 4 years old. He thought about the fact that he was standing at the gate of a farm in Clover Falls, Tennessee on a Saturday morning, and that this was where he was, and that it felt not like a temporary stop. Not like another address to add to the list that Noah kept track of in the back of the detective journal, the list that had 9 entries and that Ryan had never looked at directly, because looking at it directly was a thing he couldn't do yet. It felt like somewhere. He went back into the market and found something useful to do. Dean arrived at 2 in the afternoon, not the rental car this time. His own car, a 4-year-old Camry with a cracked rear bumper that had the look of something that had happened and been noted but not urgently addressed, which told you something about where his attention had been. He parked in the overflow grass and stood outside the car for a moment, looking at the market the way you look at something you recognized the idea of, but not the reality. Ryan saw him from the barn, where he'd gone to do the final structural walkthrough, the professional habit of a man who checks the thing one more time after it's done, because the thing you assume is fine is usually the thing that isn't. The barn was fine. Every post, every rafter connection, every section of new decking. The job was complete in every way that mattered. He came out and walked toward Dean because Stephanie was on the other side of the yard and hadn't seen him yet, and Ryan wanted to give her the choice of when to look up. Dean looked at the crowd, at the vendor stalls, at the farm in motion, People moving between the tents with purchases and conversations, and children who had found each other the way children find each other at events, through the shared language of running. I didn't know it was going to be like this, Dean said. Ryan, like what? Like this many people actually like it mattered to them. He looked at a family near the honey table, the father lifting a small kid to see the jars on the upper shelf. My father used to say the land knows who takes care of it. I thought that was something people said to make themselves feel better about working hard, Ryan. Sometimes, things people say are true. Dean looked at him. The recalibration visible not of Ryan specifically, but of the situation, of what he'd walked into, of what he'd almost been a part of destroying. Is Stephanie over there? Ryan nodded toward the documentation table. She hasn't looked over yet. That's your call, Dean. What do I say to her? Ryan, whatever's actually true. He walked away and let Dean handle the distance across the yard on his own terms. What happened at the documentation table, Ryan was too far away to hear. He saw Dean approach, saw Stephanie turn and register who it was and what it meant that he was here, on this day, in his own clothes, having driven from Memphis in his own car with a cracked rear bumper. He saw the specific stillness that went through her at the recognition. He made himself stop watching at that point. That conversation belonged to them. What he saw 15 minutes later, Stephanie nodding, the small, complete nod, the one she used when something had been accepted rather than merely acknowledged, and Dean standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the fields the way a person looks at something they've been away from long enough that it looks different. And also, exactly the same, 20 minutes after that, Dean was at the sweet potato table talking to Gerald with the focused attention of someone trying to remember something they'd stopped paying attention to a long time ago and discovering it was still there. The crowd peaked at 3:45. 204 people on the property at once. Ryan counted because Carol's paralegal had asked for a head count for the documentation. And because it was the kind of number that deserved to be accurate, 204 people. In a county of 2,900, Pat Moore sold out of everything by 2:30. She'd brought what she considered a generous supply, and the market had disagreed with her assessment entirely, and she stood behind her empty table with the expression of a professional who is simultaneously delighted by the result and furious at her own underestimation. She borrowed a pen from Noah, who was nearby documenting something, and surrendered the pen without interrupting his work, and wrote a number on a napkin and went to find Jimmy Carver to arrange a larger supply order for next week. Next week. Ryan heard her say it. Watched her move through the market with the napkin and the number, planning forward, building toward the week after this one. And it did something to the chronology of the day that he hadn't anticipated, because next week meant this wasn't constructed. Next week meant the legal argument held not as a one-time demonstration, but as a pattern of genuine commercial activity. Next week meant Carol's probably became something closer to certainly, and next week meant Ryan would still be here. He stood at the edge of the yard in the late afternoon light and let that settle. The barn was done. Had been done for nearly a week. He'd been coming down the driveway every morning anyway, and nobody had said a word about it. Not Stephanie, not Earl, not Pat Moore, who made it her business to comment on everything. The silence around his continued presence had a specific quality, the quality of something being understood without needing to be stated. He looked at the farm, at the barn with its new roof catching the angled afternoon light, at Noah cross-legged on the ground near the wreath vendor's stall, drawing something with the absorbed concentration of a child doing the thing he was made to do, at the oak line and the south pasture and the documentation table and the 204 people who had come to a farm in Clover Falls on a Saturday because someone they respected had built something worth showing up for. He looked at Stephanie, across the yard, talking to a family, the father asking questions about the farm itself, pointing at the fields, and Stephanie answering with her hands, as well as her words, gesturing at the land and the barn and the layout the way she gestured when she was talking about something she understood completely. She was good at this. The thing she didn't analyze or name the way she made people feel like being here had included them in something. Like showing up on a Saturday morning had made them part of us that mattered and was going to continue mattering after they drove home. That quality didn't come from strategy. It came from genuinely meaning all of it, and every year, and every choice she'd made to stay when she could have gone, and to hold on when it would have been easier to let go. Ryan watched her for a moment longer than he'd intended to. Then he went to find something useful to do because that was what he did when he didn't know what else to do, and it had never once failed to be the right call. The vendors packed up at 5:30, the light already low and amber, shadows running long across the yard. Pat Moore came back for her empty containers and made eye contact with Ryan that communicated, without words, that the food provision situation with Stephanie remained an outstanding item. Earl helped two vendors load their trucks at the unhurried pace of a man who has loaded and unloaded things his entire life and sees no reason to rush the process now. Dean was at the Eastfield edge in the late afternoon, standing alone, looking at the property with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone revising their understanding of something they thought they already knew. Noah found Ryan near the barn at 5:45. "Dad, Ryan, yeah, I counted 57 distinct conversations today. That's a personal record, Ryan. You had a previous record, 41. At the school thing in Knoxville, Noah looked at the journal. This was better because the conversations here were longer. People here explain things all the way to the end." Ryan looked at his son. At the curly hair and the serious eyes and the notebook that catalogued everything, because everything was worth cataloging. "Mrs. Margaret said something I wrote down for the important section," Noah continued. "She said flowers don't remember what season they're planted in, but they bloom in the right season anyway. She said they know even if they don't remember, Ryan. That's a good one, Noah. I thought so." He looked at the wreath vendor's stall, now being packed up. "Do you think that's true for people too? That you know things even if you don't remember knowing them?" Ryan thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way the question deserved. Maybe. Some things you learn so early they become part of how you move before you have words for them. Noah wrote something in the journal. Ryan didn't ask what. The yard was empty by 6. Stephanie was at the documentation table, going through the receipts with the paralegal, organizing them into the sequence Carol had specified: date order, vendor category, transaction type up. Ryan cleared the remaining vendor equipment with Earl, who had stayed through cleanup without being asked, which Ryan understood by now was simply who Earl was. He stayed until the work was finished. He didn't need to be asked, and he didn't need to be thanked. Earl left at 5:58. Before he went, he walked past Ryan near the barn door and said, without stopping, "Southeast corner fence posts. Come spring they'll need attention, Ryan." "I saw them." Earl nodded and kept walking. Then, through the open window of the truck as he started the engine, "You'll be here in spring, not a question." He drove out. Ryan stood in the drive and watched the truck go and thought that Earl Booker communicated more in 7 words than most people managed in paragraphs. He turned back toward the barn and stood looking at it for a moment, at the completed roof, the solid posts, the structure that had held through the October storm and would hold through whatever came after it for the next 40 years if someone would maintain it correctly. Someone would maintain it correctly. He was certain of that. Dean found him there, which Ryan hadn't expected. He'd assumed Dean would say goodnight to Stephanie and drive back to Memphis before dark. Dean had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at the barn the way he'd been looking at everything today, with the slightly stunned quality of a man who drove 4 hours expecting to find what he'd left and found something entirely different. "I called Carol Thompson this morning," Dean said. "Before I drove up, Ryan waited. I told her I'm not participating in any buyback transaction. She said she'd document it as a formal statement of non-participation." He looked at his hands in his pockets. "She also said it might strengthen Stephanie's case under the consent clause. Something about how the clause requires all parties' participation to be enforceable. Ryan, it will help. Dean, good." He looked at the barn. "My father built this with a guy named Earl Booker. I was 9. I remember coming out here and watching them work." He paused. "This Earl is exactly the same, Ryan." Yes, that's either reassuring or terrifying, Ryan." "I find it reassuring." Jean looked at the barn one more time, then at the farm around them, the fields going dark, the oak line a shadow, the main house lit from inside. "She's going to be okay," he said. "Not a question. Not entirely a statement either, more the way you say something when you need to hear it confirmed. Ryan, She was going to be okay before any of this. She's been okay through all of it. That's who she is. Dean was quiet for a moment, then, yeah. He said it like he was recognizing something he should have known a long time ago. Yeah, no, he stayed for dinner after all. They ate inside leftover pot pie reheated. Bread from a vendor who had left a full loaf as a thank you. Sweet potato preserves from Gerald's table that Noah had been given a jar of in exchange for the drawing he'd made of Gerald's hands. The 5 of them around the table, which was the first time the table had held 5, and which Stephanie had accommodated without comment by simply adding a chair and setting another place. Noah told Dean about the 57 conversations, about the flower theory from Margaret, about a farmer named Hal in stall 14 who had said his grandfather planted the same seed variety every year for 50 years and called it reliability. Dean listened with the look of someone doing inventory of the table, of his sister across from him, of the farm visible through the window in the last of the evening light, of everything he'd been away from and everything that had continued without him. After Noah finished, Dean said, "I want to come back next weekend." For the next market, Stephanie looked at her brother. "If that's all right," Dean said. The table was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of something that has been stated and needs to land before anyone responds to it. "Stephanie, you don't have to ask." "Dean, I know. I'm asking anyway." Something moved in her face. Not the softening that the word implied. She wasn't someone who softened. That wasn't the mechanism. More like a number being updated. A figure she'd been working with for a long time that turned out to be slightly different from what she'd calculated. "Then yes," she said. "Come back." Dean nodded. Small, overfull. Nobody elaborated, and nobody needed to, and they finished dinner, and that was enough, which turned out to be more than enough, which is what enough usually is when you stop asking it to be something else. The porch after dinner, after Noah had gone to bed, and Dean had gone to the guest house, and the farm had gone quiet, except for the usual nighttime inventory of sounds, the oak, the distant coyote, the particular creak of the farmhouse settling into the cold. Ryan had been about to go to the guest house himself, and then he hadn't. He'd stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment, and then gone up them and sat in the other chair, because Stephanie was still out there and the farm was quiet, and he was done pretending that he was about to leave. She had the documentation folder in her lap but closed. Looking at the yard, at the empty space where 28 vendor stalls had been 10 hours ago. At the barn across the way, dark and solid against the night sky, the new roofline a slightly different silhouette than the old sections. Ryan sat in the other chair. Neither of them said anything for a while. The particular comfortable silence they'd been building since the 3rd morning, since the 2nd coffee, since all the small incremental choices to remain in the same space without filling it. It had taken time to accumulate, and now that it was there, it felt like something that had always been there, which Ryan understood was how all the best things felt once you'd gotten to them. "Eventually, Stephanie," Carol called while you were doing cleanup. Ryan waited. "She thinks it's enough." She said it without the inflection the sentence deserved, still deciding. He understood how to hold something that large. The documentation, the vendor contracts, Earl's renewal agreement, the attendance count, Dean's formal statement. She said the consent clause in the 2015 contract is the key piece. Crane can't complete the buyback without both parties' participation if the threshold is being formally contested, and with Dean's statement on record, there's no viable path for him to claim all parties are aligned, Ryan. When did she think he'd move? She said she expected his lawyer to call within the week, either to negotiate a settlement or to formally withdraw. A pause. "Ryan, he's not going to negotiate." "No," she looked at the barn. "He's going to withdraw and go find a different parcel to acquire." Carol said he's been looking at something in Robertson County for the past month. She thinks this was always the exit strategy if we pushed hard enough. Then it's over. She let that land. All of it at once, not the word, which was simple, but what it covered. 4 years of managing this alone after her father. The drought years and the investment and the clause she hadn't fully understood until Carol Thompson explained it to us across in February. The letters, the Lexus on the county road, the weight of being the person in the room who was saying so and meaning it when everything around her was arranged to make no feel temporary. All of it at once. She didn't cry. That wasn't how Stephanie Harris processed things. But she looked at the yard for a long moment, and her hands on the closed documentation folder were very still, and Ryan understood that stillness as its own version of the same thing. He reached across and put his hand over hers. She didn't move. She held very still, the way you hold still when something has landed that you've been bracing for without knowing you were bracing, and the landing turns out to be gentler than the bracing. After a moment, she said, "The email from Atlanta, Ryan? Noah told you?" He mentioned it the second day after he found out. "He didn't know it was private, Ryan. He doesn't think in those categories. No." She turned her hand slightly under his, not pulling away, adjusting. The specific movement of someone choosing how to be held rather than just being held. "Have you replied, Ryan?" "No, why not?" He looked at the barn, at the roof he'd built and that had held, at the farm that spread out in every direction in the dark, 4,000 acres that he knew now by section and by boundary and by what each part needed and when. At the oak line he could identify from the sound it made in different winds. "Because I drive down this road every morning," he said, "and I've stopped being able to call that temporary." She was quiet. "I know that's not an answer to the email. I know Atlanta is a real thing with real money and real stability. And all the things I've been constructing a case for since Noah was 4. He looked at her. "But I also know that I've been here for 5 weeks and the barn has been done for a week and I'm still here. And nobody has said anything about it. And I haven't been able to write the reply because every time I open the window I realize I'd be writing it from the wrong place." Stephanie looked at him. The direct look, the one she used when all the assessment was complete, and what remained was just the thing itself. "I don't want you to leave," she said, flat. The way she said everything that was true. "I'm not asking you to stay for me. That's not," she stopped, found the sentence again. "I'm telling you it's a fact, that I don't want you to leave. And then you make whatever decision you make with that information." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not leaving," he said. She held that, not because of the email, because of all of it. He held her eyes. "Because the email is a job. A job is a place you go until something is finished. And I don't think what's happening here is finished." A pause. "I don't think it's anywhere close to finished." The porch held them both for a moment. Somewhere in the east field, the coyote called once the same one as the first evening, or another one. No way to know. The oak moved in the light wind. The farm held its 4,000 acres steady in the dark, the way it always held them, without drama, without announcement, just with the accumulated weight of having been here for a long time, and having every intention of staying. Stephanie turned back to the yard after a moment, but she didn't take her hand away from under his. "You should probably tell Noah," she said. "Ryan, he already knows." This time she smiled. Actually smiled, the full version, not the almost version he'd been cataloging since the first morning. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then it was gone, and she was looking at the yard again, but it had been there, and Ryan had seen it, and that was the kind of thing you filed in the place where you kept things that mattered. They sat there for a while longer. Neither of them moved to go inside. The farm moved around them in its quiet, patient way, and the night held them in it, and nothing needed to be said, so nothing was said, and that was exactly right. 3 weeks later, Carol Thompson sent the formal notification. Ryan was in the equipment shed on the south side, crouched in the west corner, assessing the foundation erosion that he'd been planning to address before. The ground froze, the kind of slow structural problem that announces itself by becoming a bigger structural problem if you let the first winter ignore it. His phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. 3 words. Carol called. Come. He came. She was at the kitchen table, not with the documentation folder, just sitting, phone face up in front of her, looking at the window. When he came in, she looked up and her face was weighing something he hadn't seen before, not the controlled version of an emotion, but the actual emotion, moving through her in a way that had nowhere particular to go. Crane withdrew. She said it the way you see something you've been holding at arm's length for so long that releasing it requires all the muscles at once. His lawyer called Carol this morning. He's not exercising the buyback clause. He's withdrawing from the 2015 investment agreement entirely, which voids the contract and discharges the debt. Ryan sat across from her. Carol said that he's already filed on a parcel in Robertson County. Commercial development. She said this was probably always the contingency, that if the Harris Farm acquisition became complicated enough, he'd cut his losses and redirect. She looked at the table. But he had other land. He always had other options. We were just the most convenient one until we weren't. Ryan, it's over, and she let it land. All of it, 4 years of managing alone, the drought years and the debt and the claws and the letters, the weight of being the person who said no and meant it through everything that was arranged to make no feel unsustainable. She let it all arrive at once. She didn't cry. But her hands were on the table, and when Ryan put his hands over them, she held very still for a long moment, and that was its own way of letting something land, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The wildflowers came up on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the market. Ryan was working on the equipment shed foundation, the slow, careful work of shoring up a corner before the ground froze and made the problem permanent. Stephanie had gone to check the rebuilt east fence section, the one that had held through 2 subsequent rains without any sign of movement. She came back through the side yard, past the kitchen garden, and stopped. Ryan heard the pause before he heard anything else, the specific absence of motion where there had been motion. He looked up from the foundation work. She was crouched beside that patch of ground near the kitchen garden wall, the patch they'd cleared in August for what she'd planned as a cutting garden, that had been bare soil through September and through the storm and through everything else on small green shoots. 15 of them, maybe more at the edges, in the cheerful, crooked rows of seeds planted by a 6-year-old who had taken the task seriously, and whose straight lines reflect his enthusiasm more than his precision. Ryan came over. He crouched beside her. She was touching the tip of one shoot with one fingertip, the lightest possible contact. The way you touch something you're not entirely sure is real yet. Noah planted those, Ryan said, the afternoon before the storm. He didn't tell you because he wanted it to be a surprise, and then the storm came and he forgot until last week, and then he was before he said anything to Stephanie. He forgot, Ryan. He had a lot going on. 57 conversations. The Zone 7 incident was still relatively recent in his personal history. She looked at the shoots, then at him. The expression she had was the one he'd been collecting since the first morning, not a smile Faido, but in the territory of one, the one that arrived when something caught her off guard in the right direction. What? Twy? Plant? Ryan? Wildflowers. He picked the seed packet himself. He said he picked the one with the most colors on the front. She looked at the shoots again. Then back at him. Seeds don't know what's happening above them, she said quietly. You put them in the ground, and the weather does whatever it does, and they either make it or they don't. I've been farming this land for 11 years, and I still don't fully understand how something that small comes through a storm like the one we had. Ryan, same way everything comes through. By being further down than the weather can reach. She held his gaze for a moment. Noah appeared around the corner of the guest house at speed, the detective journal under one arm, Biscuit airborne at his heels. He stopped when he saw them both crouched by the garden wall. He looked at the ground. His face went through recognition, calculation, satisfaction, and the specific expression of a 6-year-old who has successfully executed a plan he partially forgot he was executing. They grew, he said to Stephanie. They did. I put them pretty deep because the seed packet said to, and I figured if a storm came, deeper was safer, Ryan. Where did you get that idea? Noah, the instructions. Also, it made sense. He came over and crouched beside them, examining the shoots with professional interest. They're small, Stephanie. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. Noah, what are they going to look like? When they're done. She found the seed packet still tucked against the garden wall where Noah had left it 3 weeks ago. She turned it over. Read the back in the fading afternoon light. Mixed colors. Red, orange, yellow, purple. Bloom time is spring. Noah considered this. That's a long time to wait, Ryan. Some things take a long time, Noah. Will we be here in spring? The question landed in the air between all 3 of them. Ryan looked at Stephanie. She was looking at the shoots, her fingers still near the one she'd been touching. Then she looked up, first at Noah, then at Ryan, and her expression was the direct one, the one she used when she was done with the calculation, and had arrived at the answer and was ready to say it out loud without qualification. I hope so, she said to both of them, not as a performance. Just as the truth, stated the way she stated everything that was true without decoration and without apology, and with the specific weight of someone who meant exactly what they said and had learned, that meaning it exactly was the only version worth offering. Noah. Okay. He opened the journal to a fresh page. I'll draw them now and draw them again in spring and we can see how they've changed. He sat down in the dirt beside the garden wall and started sketching. Biscuit arranged himself across Noah's feet with the profound satisfaction of an animal who has completed an assignment nobody assigned him and done it correctly. Ryan didn't move. Stephanie didn't move. They were both looking at the shoots and not at each other, and the late afternoon light came low across the side of the farmhouse and the kitchen garden and the 15 crooked green shoots that had come up through storm-compacted soil and decided to be there, and the farm held all of them in the particular way it held everything, without preference, without promise, without urgency, just with the patient weight of land that had been worked and cared for and would go on being worked and fought for, long after any single reason for staying had stopped needing to be explained. Somewhere in the oak line the wind moved through. Somewhere in Carol Thompson's office a contract was void and a farm was free, and on a kitchen garden wall in Clover Falls, Tennessee, 15 wildflowers planted the day before a storm were 3 inches tall and had no interest at all in going anywhere. Have you ever held on to something so long and so hard that when the threat finally passed, you didn't know what to do with your hands? Stephanie Harris is learning what to do with hers. What about you? Have you ever ended up somewhere you didn't plan to stay and realized, slowly, that was exactly the point? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one.